I'd like to ask that please hold your applause until after the speaker is done speaking. They've taken a lot of time and they've really prepared, and we'd like to thank them, but let's make sure that we don't interrupt their preparation and their presentation. Today we have the pleasure of a co-sponsored events between the Federalist Society and the Black Law Students Association. Affirmative action, a vehicle of equality or institutionalized discrimination. Mr. Peter Kirstenauer, speaker for the Federalist Society, is a partner at Benesch Friedlander in their labor and employment practice group, where he focuses his legal practice on representing management in employment-related litigation and contract negotiations, NLRB proceedings, EEO matters, and arbitration. He was appointed as a member of the National Labor Relations Board in Washington, D.C. in January of 2006 to January of 2008. While serving on the NLRB, he was involved in significant decisions including Oakwood Healthcare, I'm not going to get that right, and Oil Capital Sheet Metals Incorporated. Mr. Kirstenauer is also recently reappointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives to his third consecutive 6-year term to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. This is a part-time position which will expire in December of 2019. Mr. Kirstenauer received his BA from Cornell University in 1976, and then in 1979 received his Juris Doctorate, cum laude, from Cleveland Marshall College of Law, where he served as articles editor for the Cleveland State Law Review. Mr. Kirstenauer, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Mr. Robert E. Richardson is speaking on behalf of the Black Lawyers Law Association. He serves as counsel of the law firm Brandstetter, Straunch, and Jennings. Mr. Richardson's practice areas include labor employment, securities, and class action litigation. Mr. Richardson also serves as a construction market representative for the Labor Employers Cooperation and Education Trust for the states of Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Mr. Richardson hosts a weekly radio show on Saturday at 11 a.m. If anybody tuned in this week, you would have heard a couple of familiar voices. It's on 12:30 a.m., The Buzz, in Cincinnati, Real Talk. He features politicians, community leaders, and public policy experts from across the country discussing both local and broad-scale issues. Mr. Richardson made history when he was elected as secretary, becoming the youngest person to ever be elected as an officer of the Board of Trustees of the University of Cincinnati. Mr. Richardson received his BSE from the University of Cincinnati in 2002, and then in 2005 he received his JD. Mr. Richardson, thank you for joining us today. Our moderator for today's debate will be the president of the Black Student Law Association, Remington Jackson, and I will now turn the program over to him.
Thank you, Amanda. Okay, so the way this is going to work is that I have lists of questions that I'm going to go over and ask our panelists to go back and forth with each other, answer questions as best as possible. After I'm through with my questions, we're going to open up to the audience to ask any questions that you may have. Please just be respectful with your questions would be the only thing I would say. Okay, so first I would just, whichever one you would like to go first, could you say whether you support affirmative action and explain why or why not?
Good, fine, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for attending this presentation, Black Students Association to Federalist Society. And unfortunately, Amanda forgot my Medal of Honor and Heisman Trophy. I specifically every time I'm introduced, they keep forgetting. I don't know why. I support affirmative action. Don't groan. I thought you probably thought we were going to be having a debate among two people who are on opposite sides. I support affirmative action. That is, affirmative action as originally constituted before it metastasized into a system of preferences, quotas, and set-asides. Affirmative action that was in outreach to those who, by virtue of minority status, may have been left out of the mainstream. I oppose the current iteration, which is set-asides, quotas, and preferences, for two reasons. The first is it's unconstitutional under Grutter and a whole host of cases. If you take a look as applied, Johnson versus Transportation Agency, Taxman versus Piscataway School District, the whole gamut of affirmative action cases, affirmative action as practiced by almost every institution in the country is unconstitutional, both on a compelling state interest prong and a narrow tailoring prong. And we can get into that a little bit later. But I'm going to suffice it, leave it at that, except for the second reason I oppose it is because even if you set aside the constitutional infirmities, there is demonstrable, copious evidence now that it harms its intended, purported beneficiaries. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I do support affirmative action, and I think it's important that we define it in the context of what it is, and we define really how we get here in a broad historical context, because I think that's very important. If you look back to 1885, Justice Joseph Bradley said that when are African Americans, called Black Americans, going to stop asking for special treatment and be treated as mere citizens? That's 1885, he said that. 1885, because they were asking for, I guess, equal treatment to make sure that they weren't discriminated against. The 14th Amendment was intended in its purpose to make sure that discrimination didn't continue and that opportunities were provided to the newly freed slaves at that time, African, and then their descendants now, African Americans, that are currently here. I will say that, of course, when the 14th Amendment was put in place, it was not enforced like it should be, of course, because in that case was about upholding the Civil Rights Act of, I can't remember, I think it's 1875. And the Congress, under Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, believed they had the right to make sure that public owners couldn't discriminate against black folks at that time under the 14th Amendment. But the court said, no, you can't apply it that far. That's special treatment. And if you look at the same language and juxtapose that to what Justice Roberts says, he says, well, the best way to solve discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, as if it's equivalent to try to remedy discrimination to the discrimination that happened 350 years ago that was institutionalized in this country to keep people out for opportunities. And I would say it just as a metaphor. It would be like playing a poker game, and one side has all the chips, and then they say, after they've gained just about every chip, well, we're going to play fair from now on. That wouldn't be fair in that context. It's not a historically accurate description of what it means to be fair. So what I think we need is a lot more than affirmative action, frankly. We need a system and a policy that will work just as hard as we work to keep institutionalized racism. We need to work just as hard to eradicate it. And honestly, it would take a lot more than affirmative action policies to do that, because what affirmative action is at its core really right now, forget what you might have thought it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, quotas are not legal. Whether they should be or not, they're not. Okay? So when I hear people say it's a quota, it's not. That's not legal. That's been the case, I believe, since 1977. What this is about is, can race be used not as the determining factor, but as a factor among many when you look at applications, when you look at giving people opportunities. And at the end of the day, if you can't use even race as a factor, how do we make sure that we have a diverse workforce? How do we make sure we have a diverse student body? How do we do that in a way, like the court said, that doesn't tax the administration too much? I haven't seen the court come up with a solution. And my real fear is that this is really leading to they don't want to address the problem in any way. Because I hear talk about, well, let's do this in a way that just looks at income. But even if you look at what they did in Texas, which is the Top 10 plan, they gave the top 10% of all graduating high schools, and they let everybody be admitted automatically. But even that, guess what? You consider race, because we are actually more segregated now, or just as segregated as we were in terms of school before Brown versus Board of Education. Our neighborhood is still segregated. These are facts. So by implication, race is being considered, but we're pretending like we're not considering it. I think the court is moving towards trying to find, even if that was done, that would be impermissible. And so we have to ask ourselves, is diversity worth pursuing? Do we think the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery is worth addressing in any manner? And if we do, how should we do it?
I'm sure you'd like to respond.
There's a lot to respond to. I already mentioned that I oppose it because it's unconstitutional, flat out unconstitutional. Compelling state interest, the first prong. Some of you took common law. I'm sure that you studied Grutter and Gratz. Under Grutter and Gratz and the whole panoply of affirmative action cases, whenever you've got a racial classification, let me pause. How many of you think the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, is a well-considered amendment to the Constitution? How many of you support it? Most of you, almost everybody does. I don't know who doesn't. The Equal Protection Clause. No state shall deny individuals or citizens within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Doesn't make any kind of distinctions based on any type of legacy. Compelling state interest is one of the two prongs to determine whether or not a racial classification, because of the odious history of race in the United States, can be justified. It's got to satisfy a compelling state interest. Throughout our history, we've only had really 2 instances of compelling state interest, something that would justify discriminating on the basis of race. Remediation of actual instances of past discrimination. Remediation of actual discrimination. So if you've got a company or a school board that's actually engaged in racial discrimination, you can remedy it by engaging in race-conscious remedies. Okay? The second is national security or /law enforcement. The theory being you have a compelling state interest. If, for example, the CIA wants to infiltrate Al-Qaeda, it can say to Justin Bieber, sorry, we don't want you. They're going to discriminate on the basis of race. Because if Justin shows up at Al-Qaeda, head comes off. Or they can say to me, we're going to investigate the Ku Klux Klan, Pete, but I'm sorry. Either you're going to have to keep the hood on the entire time, or we're just going to have to deny you entrance into this undercover operation. Mediation of actual instances of past discrimination, or national security. Pretty important stuff. Nuclear bombs going off, things of that nature. In Bruder, we've gotten to the point, because it was not litigated specifically, where they adjudged a compelling state interest to be a Korean kid sitting next to a black kid in poverty class. I submit to you, if that's a compelling state interest, everything is a compelling state interest justifying racial discrimination. Narrow tailoring. If you had 5 minutes, I'd go through the narrow tailoring clause for you. But remember, because this is important, if you're going to engage in racial classifications, and affirmative action is an overt racial classification, you must narrowly tailor that classification or the device you use to discriminate on the basis of race. It's got to be extremely narrow. With respect to affirmative action, the narrow tailoring is a fantasy. I'm going to ask you a question. Bear with me for just a couple of minutes, and I don't want to take up too much time, and I will see as much time as necessary here. Little thought exercise. Some of you may become law clerks, Supreme Court law clerks. Okay? Now you remember Bruder and Gratz. Bruder was the law school. Gratz was the undergrad Michigan admissions program. Supreme Court struck down Gratz, the admissions program, the undergrad admissions program. Why? Remember? Because it was rigid and formulaic. The undergrad program granted a raw 20-point total to blacks and Hispanics on a 200-point admission scale solely because they were black and Hispanic. That was the functional equivalent of adding a full grade point average to a black student's overall grade point average in determining whether or not they'd be admitted, or the functional equivalent of twice the value of a perfect SAT score. Indeed, beyond a minimal level of competence, it guaranteed admission. The Supreme Court said, unconstitutional, rigid, 20 points, can't do that. But under Bruder, the law school program, the admissions program, as was indicated, was one factor. Race was one factor among many. In addition to your grade point average, where you're from, your work history, what type of courses you may have taken, all kinds of other experiences, your athletic background, A holistic, individualized review was the way the law school was done. Holistic, individualized review. One factor among many, race was a mere feather or a thumb on the scale of the admissions process. They determined that to be lawful as narrow tailoring. Now, if you're a law student or a law clerk for a Supreme Court justice, let's say you have one black applicant to a law school and a white applicant to a law school, similarly situated in every respect, SAT, GPA, experiences they had, athletic accomplishments, and he applies to 3 different law schools. Both of them apply to the same 3 law schools. One is Cincinnati. And let's say at Cincinnati, the black student is 10% more likely to be admitted over his white comparative. Ohio State, you're 50% more likely to be admitted if you're black over your white comparative. And let's say Dayton, you're 100%. Now let's make it 200% more likely to be admitted. Based on Gratz being struck down, a 20-point total, how many of you would strike down the University of Cincinnati Law School's 10% advantage? Anybody? Nobody. What about Ohio State's 20% advantage? Anybody? Nobody. Okay, Dayton. 200% more likely. I see about half of you, no, 2/3 of you, maybe 3/4 of you raising your hands. 3/4 of you would strike down an affirmative action program that would make it 200% more likely that a black applicant would be admitted over a similarly situated white comparative. Based on your responses, I would gather that virtually everybody here would strike down every single affirmative action program currently in existence in the country. Because the advantage afforded black applicants over similarly situated white applicants at the University of Michigan in the year that Gratz was decided, because this was not litigated, it was not 10%, it was not 20%, it was not 200%. It was 17,400%. Whatever you feel about affirmative action, that's not a feather on the scale, that's an anvil. And in some schools, it's 70,000%. And I'll explain why this doesn't do anybody any favors in a moment.
Well, there's a lot to respond to that. Try to think of where to start. When you think about in his interpretation of a lot of the law, Grutter as it is some of it is correct. I would argue a lot of their reasoning was incorrect. To not make up for past discrimination was a mistake. Thurgood Marshall, who would know something about this, say that takes the whole idea of equal protection and turns it on its head. To say that you can't make up for past discrimination and try to find out proactive ways to address it makes no sense. Now, when we talk about these numbers, you know, I'm an engineer, so if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, but I gotta tell you, you gotta show me the numbers. Like, how many African American law students were admitted last year? Do we know? What's the number? 5? 6 out of how many? Okay, so 6 out of 72. Michigan, while they did that, I never remember the class being 30, 40, 50% African American, probably not even 10%. What affirmative action does is give opportunities to folks who are similarly situated. That's what it should do. It doesn't do quotas, because you can't do quotas. It's not legal. And we have to ask ourselves, is that worth doing as a society? Do we think the 350 plus years of Jim Crow, when, as an African American, my father didn't even have the right to walk down the street. He could be killed in Alabama if they felt like it that day. That was okay. That was accepted. And somehow, just trying to do affirmative action, doing something to give people opportunities, because we know education is the conduit for everything. And if you're not willing to provide opportunities to folks, not that aren't prepared, but have the ability to succeed, then how can we ever try to move towards an equal society, a more equal society? It's a fact that we're becoming more and more diverse, but more and more people are being closed out of opportunities. The question has to be, is that worth exploring? And the other question has to be, if we're not going to do that, why is it that these students, some African Americans and some Latinos, are not achieving at the same levels? Is it because they're inferior and not able to? Or is it because of something that we're doing wrong as a country and the systems that we put in place? I think we have to ask ourselves that question, because it's one or the other. It really is. And so Fundamentally, I think the court and Grutter got it wrong by not addressing past discrimination. But let's go forward and just assume that we go with their reasoning. It's a compelling interest to also have a diverse student body. It's also a compelling interest to have people of different races. Let me give you a concrete example, because I believe discrimination still exists. Let's look at the criminal justice system, okay? If you're an African American, you commit the same crime as your white counterpart. Or Latino, you have a 13 to 14 times more likelihood of going to jail, period. African Americans aren't the majority of drug users, but they're the majority of people that go to jail for drug crimes. There is a systemic effect going on. That's one example. So tell me this. Would you not think that those who are studying criminology and trying to figure out a process to make our society better, to make it safer, but also to make it fair, there shouldn't be African Americans that are included in that process because their experience is fundamentally different? My mother had to tell me, make sure when you talk to officers, don't raise your hands, don't be seen with a toy gun, don't do this, don't do any of that. My mother had that conversation with me when I was 15, and I did get pulled over a lot, simply because my father drove a nice car. I didn't do anything wrong, but I got pulled over a lot. The experience of being African American is different, and frankly Latino in this country, just like it's different being a woman too. So I hear a lot of pushback with race, but I don't hear it as much with gender. So why is that? And is that okay? And why is that okay to make sure that women aren't discriminated against and have an equal opportunity, but it's not okay to address past discrimination on the basis of race?
If I could respond to that briefly. Compelling state interest. Diversity has a compelling state interest, and it's true that Grutter was not making up for past discrimination. The compelling state interest was having a diverse student body. The thought being that educational benefits flow from having a diverse student body. Now, however you look at the reasoning of Grutter, that's what the rationale was. It's compelling because diversity lends to having a greater educational experience, because you will get the perspective of black students, Hispanic students, Asian students. By the way, I hate these generalized categories. Asian, as if Koreans are indistinguishable from Indians, indistinguishable from Chinese, and Hispanics, Cubans indistinguishable from Puerto Ricans, indistinguishable from Mexicans. But that's what we've got, so I'll use those categories. You're correct that the experience or perspective of a black student in certain types of subjects might contribute to the overall academic atmosphere. It may lend a different perspective than if the classroom was all white. I could see it in certain history classes, maybe in a criminal justice class. Okay? A very narrow slice of academia. I ask you, is there a black speed of light? Or engineering? Is 40 times 75 different for Hispanics than Asians? For 95% of academic pursuits, diversity is wholly irrelevant. There isn't a black speed of light, at least I hope there isn't. I hope there isn't a certain type of coefficient for the strength of a particular metal for Asians as opposed to Hispanics. That'd be kind of troubling. But that really wasn't litigated. And I wrote down what the court said were the educational benefits that come from a diverse student body, supposedly. Even though this was not adduced in evidence, they simply took what Michigan said as gospel. Promoting cross-cultural understanding, eliminating stereotypes, preparing students for a global marketplace, and more spirited classroom discussions. It sounds like something you'd be doing in kindergarten. Not at higher education. You should have learned these things when you were in nursery school. If that, I submit, is compelling, anything is justified as a compelling state interest. However, when you look at the numbers are ridiculous. Why don't we have more blacks in academia? Why aren't more blacks graduating? I'll get into that in a moment, but it's something called the mismatch effect, which is the distinct product of affirmative action programs.
I have to respond to that because I think there's some important points to pull out of that. to say that understanding culture is limited really, I think, really misses the ball in how important it is, especially in a global economy, to understand different points of view. So let's give some examples. Has anybody read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers? Anybody read that? So one of the things, I think that's Outliers, one of the things they talk about in there is the fact of cultural legacies and what that can do, and being able to understand another person's point of view and how relevant that can be. It can be relevant to everything. It can be relevant to P&G does this for a reason. Why? P&G, I think they believe in diversity, but they understand they have to sell to African Americans, they have to sell to Africans, they have to sell to Latinos, and to do that more effectively, you need to understand the people you are selling to. And if you don't have that experience, you won't be able to do it as well. You can't market to that audience as well. That's a fact. And we should embrace the fact we have differences and learn from them. In the book, though, it talked about the fact that Korean Airlines used to be one of the worst airlines in the country, okay? And they used to have crashes. And guess what? They tied it back to something that was in their culture. Because culturally, in the Korean culture, authority, you don't question authority. And so, literally, if you were to question the pilot, they would smack you in the face. Things like that they would do, right? And then once that was learned, some folks from the United States said, okay, in order to make people not feel like as if they're abandoning their cultural legacies, everybody had to learn to speak English, everybody had to learn to communicate. Because what would happen is, whenever they were talking to people with the NTSB, they didn't firmly state their case. So they would talk to somebody in New York and say, well, you know, we're kind of low on fuel. Somebody from New York says, okay, you're okay, land, and then they crashed. And this happened over and over and over again. I have a point to this. Understanding cultures does matter, and it has a broad application for us, be it crime, be it understanding how to market. It matters, and we're in a global economy. If you go to China, went to China recently, you need to understand something about the Chinese culture. There are certain things you do, and if you do that and you offend them, you're not doing business with them. So you could say it's a small thing you should have learned in elementary, but I didn't learn about Chinese culture because I didn't know a lot of Chinese students. And we, unfortunately, in America, still have a lot of areas that are completely segregated. So there is great educational value in diversity. So I just want to respond to that point. There were other things that I assume we can get to later.
So this question is for you, Mr. Personnel. In terms of, you kind of mentioned already, affirmative action, how is it harmful to students? Can you delve in it first?
Thanks. Real softball. We are going on our third generation of students who have, quote unquote, benefited from affirmative action. I'm probably the oldest person in this room, went to school in the Mesozoic era, pterodactyls and things like that were around. Affirmative action began in the late 60s. 40 plus years of affirmative action. And what do we see? We've got a lot of empirical evidence to look at now. Let's set aside for a moment, as I indicated at the outset, your take on whether or not this is constitutional. Let's simply look at it from a pragmatic, utilitarian point of view. I want my kids and my grandkids to benefit in this society. I don't want them to suffer from any residual legacy of discrimination or slavery or anything of that nature. Okay? I would like them to take advantage of all that this society offers. Now, does affirmative action achieve that objective? Let's take Michigan again. The year in which Grutter and Gratz was decided, there were 30 black law students in the entering class at Michigan. 30. The median GPA for admittees to law school that year, to the Michigan Law School, was 3.8, and the median LSAT was the 98th percentile. That's for the average Michigan law student. 3.8 GPA with a 98% LSAT. 30 black law students at Michigan. 20 black college students in the entire country met that median that year. What that means is that Michigan could vacuum up all the black students in the entire country who met the median and still have 10 spaces left over. Follow me on this. That means that they've got to dip down below into the second tier, students who've got below that median. And then Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Cornell and Stanford and Cincinnati and Cleveland State and everybody else has got to find black law students to fill their seats. And they're dipping below their median levels. To get to the point where they are sometimes 2 to 3 strata below what the median is. What is the effect of that? We've got data. The effect is that black and Hispanic law students and college students are mismatched. They are in institutions where they are not as prepared to compete as their white and Asian comparators. By the way, Asians, again, using that broad term, are discriminated against by a factor as great as how whites are discriminated against versus blacks. In other words, Asians are discriminated against more than anybody. But what you've got is a mismatch effect, and what does that result in? The mismatch is, for example, I like to think I can play against LeBron James. All right? I like to think that. I didn't play a whole lot of basketball in high school because I played basketball like a football player. I played my first couple of years, not a whole lot of preparation. If I go up against LeBron James, given my level of preparation, of course, bad example because he's a little bit better at it than I am just anyway, I'm going to get my butt beat. A better example is, I remember I played at Independence High School. Even better example, I played at Cornell. By the way, in the Ivy League we do wear athletic supporters, contrary to popular belief. But I played in the Ivy League football. Now I was recruited at Oklahoma and Michigan, a couple of other places. But as the great American philosopher Dirty Harry said at the end of Magnum Force, a man's got to know his limitations. Had I gone to Oklahoma, Michigan, or any of these other places, I'd get my butt beat. I was not properly prepared. The same dynamic happens in affirmative action. This applies only to black law students who disaggregate, who are admitted pursuant to an affirmative action program, not those who would have been admitted regardless of affirmative action. Black law students compared to their white comparators, and it's even worse when compared to Asian comparators, 2.5 times more likely not to graduate. And by the way, let's back up for a second. You guys studied Griggs versus Duke Power? Remember that case? Disparate impact. We've got a facially neutral policy that nonetheless has a discriminatory effect in its application, may be struck down as unlawful, right? Unless it's job-related and is pursuant to business necessity. Think about this. Black law students, 2.5 times more likely not to graduate, 6 times more likely not to pass the bar. 50% of black law students likely to be in the bottom 10% of the law school class, and 1/3 will not graduate. Those are the national stats as of 2011. It doesn't apply to black law students or Hispanic law students who have a similar type of dynamic. It doesn't apply if they would have been admitted to that particular law school regardless of the use of affirmative action. If you had a policy at the University of Cincinnati that caused black and Hispanic law students to be 2.5 times less likely to graduate, 6 times less likely to pass the bar, 50% of whom were in the bottom 10% of the class, a facially neutral policy that did that, you'd say, whoa, wait a minute. Stop that, cut that out, this is harmful. And those black law students go off, and who knows what they do? The ones that fail, the ones that drop out, they may have been very nice pictures on the cover of the student catalog. But what happened to them? This is a deleterious effect. The mismatch effect was probably most dynamically in play during Prop 209. Most of you weren't even born at that time. Remember Prop 209, California? Proposition 209 was a referendum in California that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race in admissions and employment and contracting, etc. Prohibited affirmative action. And at the time the campaign for Prop 209 was underway, a lot of activists were saying, We can't have this. It's an impossibility. By the way, all the political elites, all the corporate elites, all the societal elites, all the academic elites were opposed to Prop 209, which simply said, you're not going to engage in racial discrimination. You're not going to engage in racial discrimination. A fairly simple concept. All the elites, all of our betters, all the smart people were opposed to that. Educational holocaust, no blacks, Hispanics will be in California institutions of higher education. And when Prop 209 nonetheless passed, despite being outspent like 20-1, they were right. There was an educational holocaust. The admissions of black and Hispanic students at California elite schools plummeted dramatically. Cal Berkeley, hardly any black law students there, or black students at the undergrad program, and other of the highly touted California schools. Then a funny thing happened. They noticed that the admissions levels of black and Hispanic students skyrocketed at UC Davis, Riverside, some other California schools. But more importantly, the overall graduation rates for black and Hispanic students rocketed upwards. Why? The black and Hispanic students who otherwise would have gone to a Berkeley and would not have been prepared to compete yet at that level, instead went to UC Davis, where they could compete, stayed in, graduated, got a degree, became productive members of society. That's what I want for my kids and grandkids, to become productive members of society, not a mascot on the cover of a university catalog.
Mr. Richardson?
Yeah, a whole lot to respond to. Let me just, this is kind of a personal issue for me because, you know, my teachers told me that I couldn't compete either, by the way. So I had and they told, I used to take, I'll just tell my story. I took learning disability classes from about the 2nd grade to the 8th grade, but I knew I could do more. Almost everybody in my class was, guess what, black. Just about every single person, every person was actually. But I knew I could do more. Luckily, I had a strong support system at my house. I decided that I was going to work harder. I was going to take college prep classes that next year. My teachers gave me the same speech he just did. You're going to set yourself up for failure. You can't do this. You're going to set yourself up and you're going to go backwards. You see, he probably makes a legitimate case that there's some people that don't make it. But then there's also a lot of people like me that when given the opportunity, they're able to go on and graduate in electrical engineering. They're able to go on to law school. They're able to go on to make history and go on the board of the University of Cincinnati. But they have to be given the opportunity, because that's what America is about. America is about opportunity and understanding that people from different backgrounds, they may have had teachers that told them all their life they couldn't do that. Imagine not having your parents and your teachers tell you that all your life. I would rather tackle not the stigma of getting somewhere because, you know, maybe affirmative action, you could say, quote unquote, help give me the opportunity, because frankly, I'd rather be thought of as unqualified with a job than as qualified without one. And then frankly, giving people opportunity is what makes us better as a society. It's what makes us grow. And understanding that differences, people from different backgrounds, if given the opportunity, can compete and can make a difference. It also goes to the point that a lot of these schools don't necessarily set up the proper infrastructure for not only African Americans, but first generation students to make sure that they succeed. Instead, it only goes to folks that already have legacies, already have connections, already have fraternities that are already there, and it's easier for them. So my question would be, why is that? Let's make sure more students can succeed, because that's what we should do. And let's go to this Asian question, because this is something that's thrown out there so much. And as he said earlier, that's such a broad category that doesn't mean anything. If you take Asians from Cambodia, they tend to do not that well because they come from a war-torn country, a country that struggles with a lot of poverty, so they have systemic issues. But if we're comparing it to a lot of Indian Americans and Chinese Americans, there are billions of people in that country. The best of the best of the best of the best of the best come here. Of course they're going to do better. So you're comparing apples to oranges, and it's something that is used as a wedge to try to say Asians this is being used against you to discriminate. Actually, from Proposition 209, there is no empirical evidence of that. Actually, when Proposition 209 went down, admissions for Asians went down too, when you properly categorize Asians. And by the way, one final point, when you look at how wide things are for Asian, for every Asian that makes 75,000, there's another that makes 10,000. So there's it's like, you really kind of change the curve a lot. It's like if we all put our money together and say we were all worth $1.5 billion if we added Bill Gates in. Yeah, we all look pretty good then. But it was skewed. It's not accurate. So I want to make sure we're talking apples and oranges and we understand the facts and the figures as they're being presented. And finally, I haven't seen this. I would like to see, I have not seen empirical evidence that really shows that, black students are now doing better. Hispanic students are doing better when there's not some type of race-conscious effort to include folks and give them opportunities. I haven't seen that yet. I would like to see the empirical evidence on that, so I'd love to see that study.
The great thing about living in 2014 is it's no longer Selma 1964. But we very often act as if it is. Am I naive enough, again, being the oldest person in this room, to say that racism has been eradicated? No. I'm not going to go around talking about how often I've been discriminated against. I still remember very humorous stories about, I'm of that cohort that was, the first black attorney in a major firm in Cleveland, the first black partner, the first this, that, and the other thing. But it's 2014. And the good news is we have not eradicated racism, but son of a gun, we've done a pretty good job. The United States of America isn't such an awful country after all. Racism, as I tell my kids, and my granddaughter is now old enough to understand it, is a problem among all the problems and hurdles they're going to have to face in their lifetimes. And of the top 50, thank goodness, it's probably, in most cases, 38 or 39. And that's the truth. The residual effects of the legacy of racism, something a little bit different. There are a lot of residual effects. You see it played out all day long. And all you got to do is look at the newspaper, look at empirical studies. But when we talk about opportunity, the opportunities are there. No one is standing at the schoolhouse door anymore saying, you can't go to the University of Cincinnati. You can't go to Tulane, LSU, Alabama. When I was recruited, again, I don't know how I fooled people into recruiting me. Alabama was all-white football team. An all-white football team. And do you remember how that changed? When USC with Sam Bam Cunningham, I know this is way predates you, came in and drubbed Alabama, and Bear Bryant was able to convince the racists at Alabama to say, we need some of those black folks on our team. Because winning was more important than making sure they had a white football team. The barriers dropped precipitously. Affirmative action doesn't give any opportunity that wasn't there if you didn't get it out of your own initiative. What it does is it engages in racial discrimination. And as I said at the outset, I could be persuaded if the impetus for affirmative action had been and was articulated as something to give a short-term boost to those who, because of the legacy of discrimination, Jim Crow, slavery, are at a marked disadvantage. If that were articulated that forthrightly, that clearly, you might be able to persuade me. Probably not, because I don't like going down the path of any kind of racial discrimination, even if it's for ostensibly benign use. Because then rationales come into play. You can rationalize almost anything. I like the law to be clear. I like the law to be equally applied. But that's not what we have now. We don't have this kind of boost. What instead we have is a diversity rationale which was manufactured in the litigation leading up to the affirmative action cases because everyone who litigated understood that if it was presented solely as this type of boost, it could not withstand an equal protection challenge. So we've got the diversity rationale. And here's the thing. Sandra Day O'Connor wrote the opinion. She said, well, I hope But we expect or we hope that within 25 years we would no longer need this affirmative action. We're halfway there. And here's the problem. When you look at the statistics from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the nation's report card, the academic performance of black 8th graders and 11th graders was plateauing. It was below that of whites, but it seemed as if there was a chance where it was starting to increase or decrease the gap. But 25 years ago, that increase or decrease of the gap stopped, and now it's decreasing. It's getting wider. After 35, 40 years of affirmative action, the gap, the educational achievement gap, is getting wider. 25 years is not going to get it done under those circumstances. It really is not going to get it done. And that gets to the essence of something I think we agree upon. I live in inner city Cleveland. The high school nearby is Collinwood High School. The railroaders, phenomenal, like 18 state track championships and all kinds of stuff. Great school, just not the best academic environment. You take a student, a 12th grader from Collinwood High School, and sprinkle the magic fairy dust of affirmative action on him, send him to a Harvard and say, compete against your comparative from Amherst or Choate, or I don't know what your elite prep schools are here. And he's not going to be able to compete. What this does is allow the fiction of we can simply sprinkle that magic fairy dust on a chosen few and we've satisfied our obligations to the downtrodden. And it obviates the need to get into K through 12 and fix those schools, the Collinwood High Schools and others, and elementary schools. That's where the real problem is. It has nothing to do with genetics or race or anything of that nature. It has to do with inability to compete because of lack of preparation. And if we're going to continue to engage in this fiction, more black and Hispanic students are going to drop out. They're going to fail, they're not going to pass the bar exam, and that's not helping anybody except for someone's good intentions. I'm too old to be satisfied with good intentions.
You know, I have two responses of that. A lot of what he said, some of what he said has some truth. The part he said about kids not being prepared to come from a district or an area that they don't have the classes, they don't have the teachers. Why is that though? Let's ask that. Could it be because of discrimination? This is a great country, but make no mistake, we still have to work every day to improve it. We've had a lot of African Americans succeed under the most difficult of circumstances. That doesn't excuse racism. That doesn't excuse allowing the system to be inequitable. And I still asked the question earlier, I haven't received a response yet, so if it's not about inferiority, what should we do to make sure that people have that opportunity? Because guess what? Supreme Court said you can't allow kids to go to good schools either. You can't bust them in. So what can you do? You can't do it in K through 12. You can't give them opportunity when you get to when you actually get to the university. The court is trying to kill any effort to improve racial diversity, to get rid of income inequality, and they're doing it through a death by 1,000 cuts. That's what they're doing. And they live in this world where in 2014, have we made progress? Yes. Over state-sponsored racism is not allowed. The state can't come in and say, you can't go here, you can't do that. Does that equate to racism by the state doesn't exist? No, that does not. Let's ask John Crawford that. All right, right up the street in Dayton, who was just looking at a toy gun and was shot in the back because someone called, said there's a black man threatening everybody in here. Let's ask Trayvon Martin, who was killed because he was perceived to be a threat because he had Skittles in his hand and a hoodie on. Let's ask the African Americans who get locked up for the same crime that the majority population commits, but they get locked up. They have 14 times more chance of going to jail for committing the same crime. Let's look at our criminal justice system, where we lock up more people in the world than anybody yet we only make up 25% of the world's population. Let's look at the crack versus cocaine powder law, where you had a crack where it was very well known that about 90 to 95% of the users of crack cocaine were African Americans. Powder were more elites, the majority population, and to get caught with 5 grams, you went to jail for 5 years. And so we put a whole generation of people in jail. Of course we have income, of course we have inequality. And when affirmative action and all those things were being put in place, busing, it was met with immediate resistance, and in most places it never really fully metastasized at all. The Chief Justice was one of the people, Chief Justice Roberts was one of the people who was suing to stop busing from happening and affirmative action policies from happening in the 80s. You see, there's never been, as I said earlier, the same type of commitment to eradicate racism, institutionalized racism, as it was to allow it for 350 years. So to say that, 25 to 40 years of halfway trying hasn't made a difference, of course it hasn't.
Mr. Richardson, I have a question for you, and then I'll just allow you to respond. We kind of already talked about it, but in terms of affirmative action, do you think that it should be indefinite, or if there should be a cutoff point, and what would be the determining factor for the cutoff point?
Well, I would go back to the point that we need a lot more than affirmative action. We agree on part of this point that you have to change the K through 12 system too, but that requires investment that hasn't been made. It would also require looking at housing policies. Affirmative action, we're viewing it in this bubble that it shouldn't be viewed in, because it's not the end-all be-all of civil rights, by the way. It is not. We would trade affirmative action tomorrow to get rid of inequality in the justice system, to make sure we have fair housing. If that happened, we can wrap affirmative action up and get rid of it. But we are far from that.
Well, as I indicated, Senator Day O'Connor said 25 years, and the gap is getting bigger. What's wrong with this picture? Could it be that affirmative action does very little to improve the overall prospects of Black Americans as a whole? Could it be? Obviously it does. Because if you take a look at most admittees to colleges, Black and Hispanic admittees to colleges and law schools, they already come from the more elite strata of the Black community anyway. We still have more than 50% of Black males in the workforce do not even have a high school diploma. Affirmative action is not going to help them. Do you think that the city of Detroit, which has been under Black governorship or mayoralty rule for the last 40 years, has been discriminating on the basis of race? It was the wealthiest city in the world 50 years ago. Is now a third world satrap. Affirmative action is not going to help that. I would submit that affirmative action is a feel-good measure that does not just nothing to help Blacks, but affirmatively harms those Blacks who unfortunately have been designated as the people who are going to benefit from it. Those Blacks would have gotten to some school anyway. And again, if they had gotten into schools where their talents and skill levels were matched with the level of preparation necessary to exceed, they wouldn't drop out. Now, let me back up for a second and give you a real example. My night job, and I've got actually three night jobs in addition to practicing law, is, as you heard at the outset, again, the Medal of Honor, I'm really a little upset about that, but I'm on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, longest serving member there. We do studies, we have hearings. We've had several hearings on affirmative action. I have a phrase that I use in my employment law class that I teach at law school called fuzzy muffins. I don't like fuzzy muffins when my students present me with fuzzy muffins. That is happy talk or something that's not critically, rigorously thought out. Much like engineers don't like fuzzy muffins. Here's what happened at one of the hearings on affirmative action. We adduced tons of evidence, but something really stuck out for me. There was a student, and again, I don't recall because this was maybe 8 years ago we had this hearing, but there was a student who applied, I believe it was to University of Colorado Law School, Black female law student, or law applicant. She applied, got there, had fairly decent grades, but she again was was below the median of the median admittee to the University of Colorado. Don't quote me on this. I think it was University of Colorado Law School. It just strikes me as being the one, but I remember the essence of this. After the first year, she was struggling mightily. She was on academic probation, and I think there was something of interest. If she didn't get above like a 2-point-something grade point average, she would be dropped in her second year. She was given this notice. She struggled and struggled, got tutoring, worked her butt off. Smart woman, very smart, very hard worker. She could be an attorney if she wanted to. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But not prepared to compete at University of Colorado. Not yet. When she was dropped, she wrote a scathing letter to the dean, saying, "You didn't tell me." It was almost like truth in advertising. Nobody told me what the median was. Nobody told me what the percentages of graduation were for blacks, Hispanics, people in certain GPA categories, LSATs. No one told me. You simply said, "Come on in," pursuant to affirmative action. And I couldn't compete. I wasted, and I don't remember how much money this was. It was like she listed some amount of money that she had in terms of student loans and out of her own pocket that she had paid to go there for nothing, wasting a year and a half of her time at a place she couldn't compete. There were other black law students who fortunately went to schools where they could compete. And I'm not saying at any time that black law students can't compete at Harvard. There's a rumor that the President of the United States went to Harvard. That's not my point. My point is when you've got an educational system in place where people, blacks disproportionately, Hispanics less so, poor whites, aren't able to compete as readily, it doesn't make sense, again, to sprinkle the magic fairy dust on somebody and say fuzzy muffins. All is going to be well. We're not going to critically think about this. And if you flunk out, we had good intentions. 2014, good intentions isn't good enough. We need to fix the things that result in black, Hispanic, and a lot of white students. By the way, compared to the 1960s and 1970s, the cohort of white students who are failing has been expanding. And when I mean failing, they can't do anything. This is an overarching problem we've got in society. And affirmative action is just kind of playing around the edges of the problem.
I actually agree. I agree with part of that. But what I didn't hear is, what do we do to solve it? Because I actually conceded the fact that affirmative action is not the civil rights issue of the day. It really isn't. That's true. That doesn't mean it has to be an effective tool for giving opportunities to folks. I would just like to make a quick point. Simply going to Harvard doesn't mean you're smarter than if you went to the University of Cincinnati. I compete against those warriors all the time and beat them, just to say. Anyway, we do need to look at take a systemic approach about fixing some of these income inequalities, and some that were put in place, some because of institutionalized racism, some because of policies that still have desperate impacts that we don't talk about. I want to know, and my question is, what do we do to solve those? How do we make sure we have fair housing policies? How do we make sure our criminal justice system works? Because if we really look at that, that would be a whole lot harder than affirmative action. And I think it needs to be looked at. I think most people would trade away affirmative action in 5 seconds to really look at those problems. But I'm not saying this is Peter's case, but a lot of people who bring that up don't bring it up to solve those problems. They just bring it up to distract. And I would love to take a look at how to really look at solving these problems from a systems level, because that hasn't been done. And it was never, that intention never happened. And and this is where we're kind of agreed, part of affirmative action was a distraction, because there were still whole systems of income inequality, but you can get a few of the, talented tenth, as they will, in the African American community, the people from the middle class, and if you satisfy a few of them, and a few of them became exceptional, then no one else would look at what's going on in the criminal justice system. That is an issue. And if that's what we're talking about, I'm all ears. We need to look at a way to solve that. But let's not pretend that when the justices talk about trying to get rid of affirmative action, that's what they care about because they just got rid of the voting, they just gutted the part of the Voting Rights Act. That's not what they care about. They live in a world where they think income inequality, racial discrimination doesn't exist. It's made up to them, and they think, well, we're all equal here, so why don't you just do something? And if you had any problems in life, it's all your fault. There is a role for personal responsibility, of course, but let's not pretend like everyone started in the same place because it does matter where you're from. It does matter, unfortunately, because statistic after statistic, as you have cited, has shown that black and brown students are struggling and poorer students are struggling. And so how do we solve that problem? I still haven't, and if we can't do anything to look at that, how do we solve it? Race is part of the conversation too, because what they want to get to is a society where we don't talk about race and somehow pretend as if it doesn't exist. That makes it worse. We have 350 years to show that makes it worse. We have Plessy versus Ferguson who said we could be separate but equal. It does not work. We have to figure out how to address the problem, take it head on. It is hard. It is difficult. We have to have conversations like this, but then we have to really have policies that challenge, and they will not be easy.
All well said. We have to address the issues, and what we tend to do in the United States of America, especially in academia, I'll only speak for the places where I've taught, is we like to skirt around issues that are hard, certain hard truths. Again, I don't like fuzzy muffins. I didn't tolerate it from my students, don't tolerate it from my kids, tolerate it from my grandmother. But fuzzy muffles don't solve problems. What do? Again, let's set aside the Constitution. I think that's a pretty big set aside, by the way. I think that's a pretty big deal. I happen to believe that the Constitution means something. And we shouldn't just say, well, we have a means by which we can amend the Constitution. If we as a society decide we want to amend the Constitution to permit affirmative action, permit discrimination on the basis of race, fine, there's a mechanism for doing so. But in terms of how you solve the problem, here's some facts for you. We have a multi-billion-dollar apparatus to address discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin, color, religion, age, disability. Multi-billion. You've got the EEOC, you've got the state and local correlatives, you've got the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, you've got a whole host of private attorney generals. Tens of thousands of them bring actions under Section 1981, Section 1983. You've got robust affirmative action programs in every Fortune 500 corporation in the country, Fortune 1000 corporation in the country, Fortune 10,000 corporation in the country. Public sector, it's rampant. Look at the Federal Register. Virtually every day there's a notice that comes out that says, not only are we an equal opportunity employer, but we specifically want blacks and females and Hispanics to bid on this particular thing or apply for this particular job. Yet all of that still hasn't gotten us to a quote-unquote equal results society, not equal opportunity. I would submit to you, we've done a pretty good job of getting to equal opportunity. A really good job of doing that. What we don't have is equal results. And what do we need to do? I alluded to one thing earlier, and that is we shouldn't be giving a pass to individuals, and I'll include myself and all of you, all of us are in the same society, who don't hold our elected representatives to account, don't hold ourselves to account for making sure the schools K through 12 are good enough. But I would submit to you, that's skirting around the problem. Because we've got tons of evidence that even if our schools were made to be, Kansas City is a good example. I don't know if you remember 30 years ago when there was the desegregation order in Kansas City and the judge there ordered the Kansas City School District to expend $1 billion, 30 years ago now, think about this, $1 billion to improve the schools in black neighborhoods. One of these schools was extraordinary. 2 Olympic-sized pools, computers in every classroom. 30 years ago, it was something that looked like the best research university in the country. And test scores for the black students there continue to go down. You can throw money, resources, shiny baubles, all kinds of machinery. Great teachers are important, though. Great teachers, there's copious evidence that if you've got two schools similarly situated, you've got great teachers, with not a whole lot of restrictions on them, versus teachers that aren't that good, significant salutary effects for the students there. What's the most important one? Here's a program. Let me tell you about this program that there is a ton of evidence on this, and I don't know why we don't incorporate it, except it makes people a little bit nervous. This is the best program out there, other than a program with respect to having good teachers. And I can give you literature on KIPP academies and all these other kinds of schools that do an extraordinarily good job. But this program that's been instituted has been the best one. If you take two kids, remember, I talk about people being similarly situated. You take two kids similarly situated, all right? One's in the program, one is not. Each of them comes from the same income background. Each of them from the same neighborhood. Each of them go to the same school. Everything you can think about is the same. The one student in the program is 12 times more likely to graduate from high school, 20 plus times more likely to graduate from college, something like 7 times less likely, don't quote me on that figure, to get incarcerated or have any conflicts with the law, something in the neighborhood, and don't quote me on this, it's been a while since I looked at the data, 6 to 7 times less likely to use drugs, something like 4 to 5 times less likely to have a kid out of wedlock, and several times more likely to become a productive member of society. Does anybody know what that program is? Have you ever heard of this program? It's been around for a while. It's not part of the Great Society. What?
I said Head Start.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I was thinking of like, not high school, I was thinking Head Start.
No, not Head Start. Head Start's been an abject failure. No fuzzy muffles. It's been an abject failure. All it is has been an expensive babysitting program. And I can give you data on that. Sorry, I'm in the Civil Rights Commission. That program is the two-parent family. It's that simple. But it makes too many people uncomfortable. Politicos don't want to talk about it. People don't want to be judgmental. I'm not being judgmental. I'm simply telling you. You could take a black kid and a white kid, similarly situated in every respect, including both being from a two-parent family. There's no difference in achievement. None. None. When you start to factor in single parenthood, wild fluctuations. But it happens to white kids too, and Asian kids too. Then you look at the data. 72% of all kids, black kids born today, are born to single parent households. That portends more of what we're seeing right now. Among Asians, hardly any. And wow, amazingly enough, Asians are doing extremely well. Uncomfortable truths. What did Al Gore say? Inconvenient truths.
Well, part of that, when you get to the Asian part, again, we talked about that earlier. That's such a broad category. If you were to count Cambodians, people from Vietnamese, their numbers would be very similar to African Americans, Latinos. Some of them come from environments where they've had struggles with war and other issues. Now, again, if you're counting Asians and as Indians and Chinese among the best of the best, the most elite that come to the U.S., I'm not sure if that's a fair comparison to 350 years of Jim Crow. Second, I really think it's important. You talked about sports and how once Alabama understood they had to stop discriminating and make sure they put the best athletes out, they did. And that is true. But I would submit to you, I kind of wish universities would apply the same rules to athletes because they're exploiting those kids. Those kids get used and most of them don't graduate. I have a bigger problem with that than affirmative action. Because you got kids, you talk about kids that are wholly unprepared. Many athletes are able to get away with things all their life, and the system lets them do it at every single level. And then when they get there, they all think they're going to the NFL, they all think they're going to the NBA. Hardly any of them do. For every LeBron James, there's 10,000 others that end up working at McDonald's if they're lucky after the school has made millions of dollars. I find a bigger problem with that. And I still don't understand. I'm still trying to figure out what do we do to solve those issues that we talked about. And we agree that there are systemic issues that happen. How do we solve them? What do we do? And at the end of the day, the two-parent household, I think that skirts the issue too, frankly, because part of that reason, if one of every three black men is in jail, of course they're not going to have a two-parent home. One in three African Americans are in jail, many for drug crimes.
Chicken and egg.
So
1950.
we have to figure out. Go ahead.
Let me just interject something, and I apologize for doing
No,
this,
go ahead.
because I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying. 1950, before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, before affirmative action, the number or percentage of young black teens who were employed exceeded that of white teens. In addition, there was virtually no difference in the employment rates between black men and white men. Okay? Now we have the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, the 68 Fair Housing Act, the 1991 Civil Rights Act, the multi-billion-dollar apparatus I talked to you about, affirmative action all over the place, and the unemployment rate for black teens, the labor participation rate, which is the real rate, is 70%. It's ridiculous. How is this? How did this happen? If affirmative action is such an unalloyed good, how come they not getting the job done? What is the problem here? Again, I've got a problem with affirmative action because it's unconstitutional. I've got a problem with it because it demonstrably does not work. We're focused on the shiny ball over here, and black people are suffering tremendously despite all of these laws we've put into place. Something better needs to be done. And I submit that one of the things, again, we're not going to be able to address the single parenthood issue. That's something that is cultural. There are no laws that say you must do this, you must do that, you must marry this person. That ship is sailed. And I don't know what you do in law about that. But what we can do as a society is do those things that permit for schools at the K through 12 level to educate kids the way they should be educated. Again, I use the term again, no fuzzy muffles, no ridiculous courses about navel gazing. Adding 2 + 2, writing well, thinking well. But we don't have that in many places in K through 12.
The best teachers, it's hard to get the best teachers to go into these environments, let's be honest. Because they're in environments people don't want to go. It's more challenging. If you're the best teacher, you stay in that environment for the least amount of time you can and go to somewhere where it's easier, to another neighborhood that's in, an area where you don't have to have any of the economic challenges that are going on in certain neighborhoods. The problem, affirmative action, there's nothing wrong with its original concept. The problem is the system is not equal, and we never really address ways to fix it. That's the issue. That is the issue. And unless we are willing to do that, things will continue. We have to continue to look for ways to improve it. Affirmative action is a very small thing that doesn't really do that much, frankly. That's true. But it helps some people get an opportunity. It is worth that. And what we have to do is, well, how do we make sure opportunities are expanded? Because this by itself isn't working. That's true. I mean, you can't really deny that. But it was never really intended to work, because from the very beginning there was mass resistance. And the criminal justice system, I would submit to you, is one of the major reasons for that, because in the 1970s we didn't lock up near the amount of people we did. It wasn't even close until we really went after the quote-unquote war on drugs, and that really ended up being just a war on certain communities. That's your issue. And we need to figure out how to shut that down. We shut that down, we can save a lot of money. That money can go towards education, and we can really change things. But not giving people opportunities who are African American, who come from different backgrounds, they need to be in those positions so people can hear this point of view, because otherwise they wouldn't hear it.
Why don't we open it up to
Yeah,
someone
that's what I
else's
was saying.
questions?
So I'm assuming people have questions.
I have a question for our medalist of honor. So you mentioned and attributed the higher bar passage rate in California to the passage of Proposition 209. And I was wondering, since the bar is ostensibly of the same difficulty for a graduate of Berkeley as it is for a graduate of UC Davis, how it is possible to attribute the higher bar passage rate to the banning of affirmative action programs.
If I said it was a higher bar passage rate after 209, then I misspoke. I don't recall saying that. What I said was that the graduation rates were higher, okay? That those who get into law school pursuant to affirmative action have a higher propensity to fail the bar exam. But the reason why the scholars who've looked at this assert that graduation rates for Black and Hispanic law students rose after Prop 209, and I just want to make sure this is clear. Again, it's not bar rates for this particular discrete example, is because those students went to schools where they were more likely to compete and wouldn't drop out like the woman I mentioned who went to Colorado, wherever school she went to. What we also see is there's a significant amount of data with respect to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And what we find is those schools, there are just a handful of them, produce an overwhelming number of Black scientists, technicians, engineers, and people in the sciences generally. One of the reasons for that, the data shows, is that because students, Black students who went to those HBCUs, first of all, and I'm not suggesting Black students should go into HBCUs, it's the dynamic that I want to get across here, is that they went to schools where they felt comfortable, and number two, they were prepared to compete. And they're more likely to go into STEM, science, technology, engineering, math courses, than they would be if they had gone to, say, an Ohio State or Cincinnati, a traditional majority school. Okay? And again, I'm not saying that Black students should be relegated to these schools. It's the dynamic that prevails. In other words, they were prepared to compete at that level, so we're more likely to pass freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, senior year, compete at a level where they were getting a 3.5 average as opposed to a 2.5 average, so we weren't getting frustrated and would see the course through, finally get their degree, and become engineers. That's the dynamic that prevails. It's that mismatch effect. Until such time as we start at the very beginning and have K through 12 schools where Blacks are as prepared as, in general, as whites and Asians, you're still going to see a mismatch with more Blacks flunking out. Let me also say, though, it's not simply the mismatch effect that results in Blacks doing less well in colleges, at which, the California colleges. There are certain financial issues and things like that. But when you correct for those variables, and we've done that, you take all those variables out, the biggest problem still is the mismatch effect.
I would just submit, I completely disagree with the mismatch effect, if you could guess. And I don't think there's any empirical evidence to really show that. What really happens is that either you have, the reason why a lot of African Americans succeed at HBCUs is because there's institutional support there. It's real simple. When they go there, they say you can succeed, and they make sure that they do everything possible for them to succeed. That's it. That's the reason. And when they come out, they are more prepared because they're in an institution where they're supported. Now, I'll give you an example here. At the University of Cincinnati, we have a great program called the Emerging Ethnic Engineers Program. I came out of it. It has a lot of those models that are used in HBCUs to make sure students succeed. Guess what happens? When African American students come out of there, 50% after that first year make the dean's list, which is very hard in engineering. They have a higher retention rate than the majority of students, and almost anybody, it's about 90%. So guess what? It's about putting systems in place to make sure students succeed. African Americans aren't inferior. They have the same skills as anyone else. Our DNAs are the same, just in case everybody knows scientifically. There's no real difference between us. It's just about what position you have in life and what environment you're in, period. That's all it is.
With respect to the HBCUs, I would commend you to the report of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights conducted in 2007, which shows clearly that the reason for the success is not so much that the support systems are there. Those are nice. There's support systems in a lot of places. There's support systems at majority schools too. Again, in the Mesozoic era, when I went to Cornell, I had support all over. These guys were breathing all over me. They wanted to make sure that the black specimen here did okay. I mean, they smother the heck out of it. All right? HBCUs do a good job of that, no doubt about it. That doesn't mean that the University of Cincinnati, as you just described, don't do a similar job. The real issue is the student able to compete at that level? Can Kirsten compete against LeBron James when he never played basketball in high school except for 1 year? This is the kind of problem that we face. Again, are there other variables at play? Absolutely. But we're here to talk about affirmative action. And I would submit to you that there is considerable evidence now over the last 20 years of study that affirmative action has a significant deleterious effect on the purported beneficiaries of affirmative action.
So, more questions?
I have a question. You mentioned that, in your opinion, racism, and I'd rather use the word white supremacy, that's a different conversation, would probably rank about 38 in terms of the things your children would have to worry about. I mean, it sounded very dramatic, but I'd really like to hear the 37 other things that come before that.
Oh, sure. What are the things you face in your daily life? What are the things you face, any one of you face in your daily lives? Getting up on time.
Shelter, the basic necessities.
All kinds of stuff, right. Again.
But I'd like to hear some of that stuff.
Stuff? Okay, here are the problems. In 2014 America, you guys, every single one of you, are fortunate beyond belief. You live in the greatest society in the history of the world. You may not learn that in your history classes, unfortunately, but you do. Have there been problems in the society? Absolutely. We're human beings. I just cited all of them. I'm not lying to them. I experienced some of them. No fuzzy muffins. No excuses, as one of my colleagues said in one of her books. You have more advantages than any cohort in the history of the world, in any nation, at any time. You've got iPhones, you've got iPads, you've got cars, you've got everything in the world to help you succeed. You've got, as I said, a multi-billion-dollar apparatus, and yet you still think you got it bad? Come on, give me a break. Sorry to wake you up here. Get a life, become adults. Again, in the Mesozoic area, I saw some things that weren't very good. My wife comes from, or her family comes from Oklahoma. Ever hear the Tulsa riots? Kind of tough. Not happening today. Not happening today. What we do have, though, is we've got a fairly large grievance industry out there that perpetuates all the bad things about America. It tells you you can't do things because of the color of your skin. What a horrible thing that is. To say to somebody, you cannot succeed because somebody is out to get you. Who's out to get you? Who's that amorphous guy out there? Point to him. Tell me who it is. And then tell me why you then didn't walk down to the EEOC, the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, the Department of Justice, led by a black man. Why didn't you seek redress? You've got all these things to help you seek redress, and you didn't do so. Shame on you. There are lots of things that are impediments to your advancement, far fewer than there were 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. If you can't succeed in the United States of America, given all the advantages you've got, black, white, Hispanic, or Asian, check yourself.
I would just respond to that. You know, there's a lot to respond to on that. But I guess you could ask John Crawford what he was looking out for when he got shot in the back for just shopping, right? We can ask Trayvon Martin what he was looking out for when he was murdered for having Skittles. But you know what? I can, bringing in all the grace I have, can understand how that happened to Trayvon Martin. Because in our society, it is perpetuated over and over again that African Americans are the greatest perpetuators of crime. You see a crime, you're usually going to see an African American put forward. And so how racism works is not that people overtly, I believe most people believe that they're not racist and don't have any racist tendencies. It's not, we all have it. That's a fact. And African Americans even discriminate against African Americans from a subconscious level. And so when things are reiterated to you over and over and over again, yes, it becomes true. It's the reason why my teacher told me I couldn't succeed and told all those other black students they couldn't succeed. And there's probably millions of students that get that same lesson. And they believe it. And it becomes their reality. So when something is put into your head over and over again, when the people above you say you can't get in, when people above you do not give you an opportunity, yes, there's a less likely chance you're going to succeed. There have always been exceptional people. Look, 100 years ago, in the midst of discrimination, we had really great performers. We had, Dorothy Dandridge. We had Sammy Davis Jr. The same argument was made. Racism doesn't exist. People can do whatever they want. The same argument was made then. The same argument was made with Plessy v. Ferguson. Separate but equal. The same argument was made not to extend the 14th Amendment to make sure that those who were owners, education institutions, they say, look, why, as I started my quote, Justice Joseph Breyer, I forget his name, Bradley, said that when are black Americans going to stop asking for special rights and be treated as mere citizens? He said that in 1885. So we shouldn't be delusional about this. There are differences. It doesn't mean we're not a great country. Anybody has kids, if you love your kids, you still have to tell them when they're wrong and how to improve. It doesn't mean that you don't love them or you don't think that your kid is great. You could say the same thing about the country. Our country has a lot of great things. It is the greatest country in the world. It doesn't mean we don't improve and don't make sure that we take it on head on. We can't address race as if it doesn't exist. We can't look at it and pretend like it doesn't. It always makes it worse.
As a matter of law, we have equal protection clause. We are a nation of laws or a nation of men. And when we behave as a nation of men, you have Jim Crow. You have discrimination because men make the rules. They change the rules whenever they want to at a whim. So the rules must be ingrained in law. They must be immutable. Immutable only when you follow the mechanisms to change them appropriately. That's why we have a constitution.
Agreed, but they need to be applied equally.
Absolutely.
But they're not. So we go back to the crack cocaine disparity, all the other disparities. They're not applied that way.
Affirmative action is not going to change that. Crack
We
cocaine,
agree.
there's no affirmative action criminal. If somebody beats me over the head,
One question.
Okay.
Do you think racial discrimination exists and should we have remedies to address it?
We have remedies to address it, not just talk about it.
Do you think?
Let me ask you a question. Who's been discriminated here on the basis of race? Raise your hand. Okay, I have several people who have. Who? Raise your hand again. When were you discriminated against?
Mostly every single time I ever walk into North.
Give me a specific example.
When I walk into Orchards and I'm
No. Tell me what happened to you and how were you disadvantaged?
Well, most
No
of the
fuzzy muffles, specifically. I like making people uncomfortable, I'm sorry. Because no fuzzy muffles.
Okay.
I want to know, how were you disadvantaged? Did you pay more for something? Were you declined an opportunity to do something? Were you given a bad grade that you can demonstrably prove somebody else who was equally...
But that's part of the problem.
Can I give a more concrete example?
Go ahead, give me an example.
In kindergarten, I was failed.
What's that?
I was failed.
In what? I'm sorry.
I was failed out of kindergarten because I was black.
How do you know that?
Because the teacher admitted it. She said she
The
doesn't
teacher
like
said you're
mixed.
not getting out because you're black?
I don't like mixed children. She said it's wrong.
And then, did your mother do something about it?
I had to get pulled out and moved to my grandparents' house in order to go to school.
Your mother did not file any kind of a suit. She didn't go see an attorney. She didn't go to the EEOC. She didn't go to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice.
Because the realistic.
Because the point here,
Everybody does.
wait a minute. Hold it.
Respectful.
There are so many things available. I'm not saying your mother should have done any of these things, but son of a gun, it's not like there are no remedies. And tell me specifically then, how would affirmative action remedy that? If in fact she was failed out of kindergarten,
Here's how.
what does affirmative
That's a good
action do
question.
to remedy that?
I have an answer for that. Because if more teachers were given an opportunity to understand where she came from, that would have stopped. Because they said, no, you're not going to do that. But she probably didn't have the experience of being around a lot of African Americans, so she didn't have that experience. That would be my guess. And then you didn't have a lot of African American teachers that were given that opportunity to get there. So yes, having a diverse workforce can make better decisions. So she's all the way in law school. That was a bad decision based upon the limited perspective of that person who didn't get a chance to work with others and experience the cultural diversity. So yes, affirmative action could have addressed that.
Okay, and before I ask somebody else for their experience, specific experiences to discrimination, that can, I would grant to you that was something that happened to you. She told you she doesn't like mixed kids, okay?
I got like 10 for you.
All right? Are you a law student here?
I am.
You are. How did that experience disadvantage you? Would you have been at a different law school? Would you have been in medical school? What did that experience do that caused an adverse impact on your life?
Well, for one thing, it told me that I wasn't good enough.
How'd you
And
get
for
to
a
law school?
long time, well, even when I got to undergrad, I had a confidence problem.
Right.
Where I didn't want to go to white professors or talk to other individuals in those positions because I felt like, in my experience, I was always told I wasn't good enough, so I'm not good enough to talk to you, so I'm not going to address the issue.
And I want to put a part in there. It's not about her. It's about, like I said, it's about the other people in my class that didn't have the same strong parents that would push that out. What about who knows how many other black students she did that to? What about them? That's really what we're talking about. She should be the rule instead of the exception.
No one is saying there's no racial discrimination. I'm still trying to look at the adverse impact. Where would you have been today but for that incident?
See, and this is the problem with the theory of the way Justice Roberts and everyone looks at it.
It's
no matter, we can give all the evidence because there's plenty of
Because I will
evidence
tell
of
you,
desperate impact,
as much
but
as
they'll
I-
never accept that race has anything to do with it as a discrimination.
You're younger than my daughter is. As much as I find that despicable and appalling what she did, son of a gun, I'm still trying to see what is the deleterious impact. Are you psychologically damaged? Are you not in the law school? Would you have been an astronaut instead?
Well, let's get some more questions.
One more person who's been discriminated against, please.
So, go ahead.
I have not been.
Yeah, let's get it.
I had a question. So you were talking a lot about statistics earlier,
Yeah.
but when you're looking at 1 in 4 Black and Hispanic students are not graduating from high school, and yet you're asking her to name specific events of racism that would have held her back, but you're not acknowledging the fact that this is an institutionalized form of oppression that is holding children back from birth. And it's not something that you can name specifically. I failed this class because I was Black, because you were put in those positions from childhood.
Put in those positions?
Yes.
Please explain to me. I'm very confused as to put into positions.
Inner city schools.
Who put those people in the inner city schools?
Discriminatory policies.
Discriminatory policies in Detroit, in Cincinnati, in Cleveland, in Cleveland,
Yes, it
in
happens
St.
everywhere.
Louis.
Yes.
Then you better talk to the black mayors who've been in there for the last 40 years. You better talk to the councilman who's discriminating. Where are these people? Almost every school in the city of Cleveland, I don't know about Cincinnati, the school board is predominantly black. The council is predominantly black. Black mayor, Frank Jackson, we've had black mayors, Carl Stokes, as you know, was the first black mayor of a major city in 1968. You better talk to them. They're the ones who apparently are doing it. We had busing there too. We had all of these things. Detroit has been under black leadership for 45 years.
If I may,
So has the school district.
That's not true. Detroit was under the leadership of corporate America. So you are really
Corporate
not
America?
accurately reflecting.
Did
how
corporate
the
America
industry
prevent Coleman
led that
Young?
economy.
Are you
And there
actually
were
saying?
black people who were in positions in the municipal area of Detroit, they did not control the economic outcomes. And where the money goes.
A mayor does not control the outcome of
Not
where
to the
somebody
extent
goes to
that
school.
you're portraying, sir.
General Motors
No.
wanted.
No, sir.
This,
Not to the extent
give
you're
me
portraying,
a
sir.
specific example, not your presumption.
We do not have to.
What I do have is
Feel like
some.
you're
We have some amorphous corporate America. These the unseen hand apparently of a really kind of screwy Adam Smith, who controls all these things.
So you don't think they have any? You think?
Sure, they've got. Are you trying to tell me that a black mayor cannot make sure that black kids get a good education?
Peter, one question. You think a mayor has more power than the Fortune 500 companies in Detroit? You really?
Absolutely, if he's smart. Are you trying to trying to tell me that a country that has a black president, attorney general, Fortune 500, 20, 30 Fortune 500 corporations have black CEOs? Again, this is not 1964 Selma, Alabama. In one evening, I acknowledge, in one evening, there is no way in the world that I can adequately convince you of something you've been told, or disabuse you of something you've been told over the course of years of your high school and
Sorry, I work
college
in corporate
experience.
America, this is not something that I've been told. So I respect your position, I do not mean to interrupt, but we're in a classroom full of people who, the majority may be students. So, I mean, perhaps they're more impressionable than I am, but perhaps.
I'm not trying to impress
being
anybody.
condescending, but my point is this. The way that you're speaking is in absolute terms, and it doesn't give fact to the other variables. Corporate America is another variable, and that's it.
When you correct for all of the variables.
One more question. Name questions. Go ahead.
I was just gonna hop in on the corporate America argument. I mean, for years, Detroit has raised their tax rates and ran huge corporations out of their city, so I don't see how corporations control.
So the auto industry in Detroit had a great impact on the policies. And those policies determined, they just did.
Wait, what's the question?
What is the question? What's the question?
Information so we can exchange
Yeah, just,
links and
what's the
data.
question? What's the
That's
question?
possible.
My question is, how did corporate America or any of the big five automakers, how did they control the city and the mayor when the mayor was raising their taxes? They don't want to raise their taxes and get ran out of the city.
Well,
They don't control.
Well, the part of not being raised taxes I'll agree with, but the part where they had no control of the mayor, I just can't. I will say this: how corporate America, it's not just the big three. All right, if we're talking about how some in corporate America contributed to institutionalized racism, let's go with the industry that really matters the most: banking and finance. Okay. Fact: they didn't give loans to African Americans. And they made sure that and then the real estate agents wouldn't sell to folks in certain nice neighborhoods and other neighborhoods, no matter what. That is corporate America. That is the people controlling the finances. Everybody with the money made sure that African Americans were kept out of certain neighborhoods, kept out of opportunities. Those same neighborhoods still have the best schools, the best resources. That's a fact.
So, just to be respectful of your time, I'm gonna let you guys both have some time as your closing arguments, and then if you guys want to stay after, just to answer more questions. I just want to understand where you
Is there one more question? One more question.
All right, wait, one more.
All right, I just want to know if either of you gentlemen can address why the conversation of affirmative action seems to focus so much around race and not gender. A scholarly article and information shows that white women have actually been one of the more beneficiaries of affirmative action in this country.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's why I say affirmative action is a big shiny bubble that doesn't do anything to help blacks. It really doesn't. I've given you stats, and I guess maybe some people don't care about the stats. They don't care about the facts. That black people black students are failing out at a greater level if they are mismatched in that respect. One of the things that we know also is in the college level, I think, 58 to 60% of college grads now are female. Maybe we need affirmative action for males now. We have an environment right now where we are kind of playing these rejiggering games where we're trying to get the appropriate mix, as they say in Bruder, a critical mass of a certain percentage of individuals from certain ethnicities, and that somehow that's going to solve the problem. Again, focused on affirmative action. If you don't care about the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause, then look at the results. Just look at the results. They're there. Go to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights website, go to Professor Richard Sander, go to Stuart Taylor, go to a lot of scholars who've looked at this evidence. So if you're satisfied with continuing with a regime that perpetuates, maybe well-intended, make you feel good, but it doesn't get the job done, fine. I don't care about feeling good or being well-intended. I care about, does this solve the problem? And as a predicate, I care about, is it comporting with the Constitution?
I would say just very, very quickly, that's a really good question. I wish I had the answer, but if we understand that we should help women because they've been discriminated against, because they have, by the way, let's just be honest. Women across the world are still the most discriminated against, period, if you factor everything together. And women were discriminated as well. And what needs to be understood is that after the civil rights movement, it's a benefit for everybody. So when I hear this argument that somehow it's a zero-sum game, that it's not true. Because of civil rights, because of the opportunities that were put forward, it's helped everybody. And it really has. So in terms of, and I'll just get to my closing statements on this, because I think it's time to get to that. Yes, we don't have overt state-sponsored discrimination that is out there loud. No one can put a cross burning in front of your lawn anymore. You know, it's not permissible to, if you see an African-American woman, rape her and get away with it. Used to be in 1950, okay? It's not permissible to just, you know, lock up an African-American and make him work, even though slavery was supposed to be over. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were passed. Slavery continued until the Civil Rights Act. That's a fact. So when I hear this about affirmative action being such this equivalent to that, you have to be kidding me. It is not. Let's just be honest about that. It is nowhere close to that. Now, whether we think affirmative action is the right solution, that is a fair, good faith discussion that we can have. It is not perfect, because when you reduce anything to race, it does, I understand the visceral reaction and why that's difficult for people to accept. But where the court is really going, the court is pretending as if racism doesn't exist. They're pretending as if we shouldn't address inequalities and all the things that happen to create those conditions. And they're saying, they're making the analogy like I did earlier. We've had a poker game, we got all these chips stacked up, we just need to play fair from now on. That can never be fair in a historical context. If we really want to move forward and really make sure that the Equal Protection Clause lives out its meaning, we have to look at ways to solve and remedy historical and current inequalities. Because unfortunately, the 14th Amendment has been, over the last 30 years, we've had a more conservative court, so they've interpreted it as such in a way that you can't do that. That doesn't mean I agree with that interpretation. I agree with Thurgood Marshall's interpretation. What's been done is to turn the whole point of equal protection on its head. The point was to make sure that discrimination didn't continue and that those who were discriminated against get equal opportunity. And no, we don't have complete equal opportunity. We don't need equal results. We do need equal opportunity. You can't have equal opportunity if you have schools that are not equal. You can't have equal opportunity if you have a criminal justice system that targets one population more than the other for the same crimes. We are not in an equal society, but we have to keep moving and keep making sure that we improve to do that. We can't give up and say we've achieved the promised land. We haven't. And we may never get there because we are imperfect people. And we have to keep pursuing perfection. That's what the American democracy is about. That's what we've done. We haven't got it right all the time, but eventually we do get it right.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank you and everybody here for a very lively and entertaining discussion. Affirmative action. It is something that will be stricken as unconstitutional at some point in the near future. It's already been signaled under the Schuette case and also Fisher versus Texas. The way it's applied, it's unconstitutional. As I indicated, when you look at the numbers with respect to narrow tailoring, that's not narrow tailoring. It's not a mere thumb on the scale or feather on the scale. It's an anvil on the scale. So from the constitutional perspective, and I think the Constitution is very important, it's unconstitutional. Now, if you don't really care about whether or not it's constitutional because you think we should mediate this in a way that we should have a certain outcome, the outcomes are not good. Not only is it unconstitutional, but it doesn't work. So the question comes to, if it's unconstitutional and it doesn't work, why do we continue to persist in a regime that has a manifest deleterious effect to the purported beneficiaries? Why are we doing this? I would ask you this question. If you knew that CVS sold a product that caused a certain segment of the population to get arthritis, to be hindered in some fashion, to maybe not be able to work or get the job they want, would you continue buying the product? But we continue to buy affirmative action. And we have a visceral reaction, as we've just seen here, and I'm partially, well, maybe mostly responsible for it. There's a visceral response to the suggestion that maybe we shouldn't have affirmative action, when we've got evidence that it doesn't work. Why? And I would suggest, clearly, we're all on the same page with respect to being against racial discrimination. Affirmative action doesn't redress those imbalances. If anything, the evidence shows it exacerbates them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.